So again, after having that discussion with Spirit, I asked, is there anything else you would share now? And the answer was, yes. We are looking at motives. Motives are the source of all things vibrationally. Each idea is the manifestation of its source. If you really want to change your experience, you must be willing to change the source. The place to keep your mind, your attention, your awareness is on the moment called now. Now creates all experience. To miss now is to sleep through the moment of creation. Now is a moment of motive. Look at your purpose. Why are you doing what you are doing? Whether that be a seeming action in the world or an action of thought in the mind. Notice the motive that drives the current response. This is an awareness I ask you to cultivate. Through cultivating this awareness, combined with your true desire to know thyself as you are, choices will change. And through that, all else changes naturally. Well, this is something that is also taught in NTI. So this is not the first time that Spirit has given that teaching to me. And I had started looking at motives before this point. It may have been retaught now because of the joining with Laurent. That may have been why it was retaught now. But I had already started to look at motives, and I had been looking at motives for some time. And I remember my early experience of looking at motives. I remember noticing that I would do a lot of things out of guilt. And I could also say fear, but the truth is the fear stemmed from guilt. If looked at a little closer, if the fear was looked at a little closer, it stemmed from guilt. So ultimately, I did a lot of things out of guilt. And I remember stuff as simple as, someone would call me, and I would feel, for example, that my mind was occupied in something and it wasn't a good time to answer the phone. But out of guilt, I would answer the phone anyway. Or someone would call me and I wouldn't really want to return that phone call, but out of guilt, I would return the phone call anyway. Or someone would ask me to do something and I wouldn't really want to do it, but out of guilt, I would do it anyway. Or out of fear that I would appear unworthy if I didn't do it, or that they wouldn't like me if I didn't do it. But if you trace that back, you can trace that back to guilt. So what I noticed when I first started looking at motives is that through my reason for choosing to do things, right? Through my reason, my underlying reason, basically, you could say I was constantly teaching myself that I was guilty or unworthy. I was constantly teaching myself that I had to perform in a certain way or else. I mean, like it was always on the edge. I was always on the edge of that cliff, right? In any second, I would slip and fall into the abyss of permanently guilty, permanently unworthy. Everyone knows it, and from there, you cannot recover. And as I really looked at this, just took time, not with analysis, but just looking. There's a way to look without analyzing. What you need to see will show up for you, and you just look at it. So as I really looked at this, I came to recognize that the vast majority of the important decisions I'd made in my life, like career choices, choices about where to live, all kinds of choices that were big decisions, I noticed that what was really underneath all of them was this fear of being unworthy, of not being good enough. I kind of saw that my whole life was a mask. And I also came to realize that I had no idea what choices I would have made if that motive hadn't been there. Because it was always there. It was always driving my decisions, driving my choices. I was always a hair away from having my unworthiness exposed, right? Always just a hair away. So when I discovered that this had been the underlying motive of my entire life, I also realized this needed to change. I realized I could not, I don't know how to put this into words. None of the words that are coming to my mind seem to fit. Okay, here's a word that fits. I realized I could not be free, really free, and know freedom, and know myself as free, and continue to live driven by this motive too. I knew the motive had to go. But the motive was a habit. So what I started to do might be a bit extreme, or it might sound a bit extreme, but it really worked for me. What I started to do is that whenever I felt to do anything, return a phone call, wash laundry, play a game with my daughter, whenever I felt to do anything, I would check and I would see what my motive was. And if the motive was guilt or fear of unworthiness, I chose not to do that. And this scared me too. I'm not going to say it didn't, because there was this fear, because guilt was such a big motive in my life. There was this fear that if I stopped doing things based on guilt, I would never do anything again. I'd never call anyone again. I'd never return an email again. I'd never play a game with my daughter again, right? Because it was all based on guilt. So there was this fear that I would never do anything again. And underneath that was the real fear that I would be exposed as unworthy. That the mask would be ripped off, right? The game would be up, right? So it was really scary for me to do this, but for some reason I did it anyway. I think that's because my knowing that it had to be done in order for me to be free weighed more within myself than the fear of what would happen if I didn't. It's like if you could have put them on scales and weighed them, those two choices, the knowing that I really needed to be free of this underlying motive would have weighed a little heavier on the scale. That's the only explanation I have for why I did it anyway. And then I went through a period of months, months, of every time I noticed that guilt was my motive, I did not do that thing. So like if you called me, and I really didn't want to call you back, and guilt was telling me to call you back, I wouldn't call you back. And what I began to discover as I let go of guilt by not following its directions, I began to discover that there was another motive, which doesn't even have a name to it. You can't describe this motive. It's just a do-it feeling without, I always say it had no baggage attached, just a do-it feeling. But I discovered another clean motive, another clean motive that would just prompt me, okay, now return that call. Okay, now go spend time with your daughter. Okay, now wash laundry. Like, those instructions came up anyway. Actually, Lisa, you owe me a call. I called you today and I'm waiting for you to return my phone call. And I sent you an email too. Anyway, but no guilt, whenever you get around to it. She says she didn't feel like it. Anyway, what I found when I didn't do things because of guilt, and I did have to go through, like, I do remember, there was a phone call. I mean, I remember the specific. There was a phone call, and I think literally approximately 8 days passed. And every time the idea to return this phone call came into my mind, there was guilt, so I didn't. There was guilt, so I didn't. There was guilt, so I didn't. And then, like, on the 8th day or so, the idea popped up, and it was clean. And so I did. And I don't remember who the phone call was to or anything, but I do remember that it was fine. That it was fine. So I started learning to pay close attention to my motives. And I started noticing that if my motive was guilt or fear, that I could not do that thing, and everything worked out okay anyway. Some things just didn't need to be done. Sometimes the clean prompt would come up later, and I would do it then. And what happened through this exercise, this practice, was eventually my motives became clean. My motives are clean. I'm no longer driven by guilt. I'm not driven by fear. Instead, I followed that clean prompt. In that way, I am free. So let's go back to the message then. Let's just read what Spirit said one more time. I said, is there anything else you would share now? And Spirit said, yes. We are looking at motives. Motives are the source of all things vibrationally. Each idea is the manifestation of its source. If you really want to change your experience, you must be willing to change the source. Now remember, by living off of guilt as my motive, I was teaching myself constantly that I was unworthy. And that colors your experience like crazy. Anybody who experiences that knows what I'm talking about. But if I stop living off of guilt, and I start just living off of clean prompts, just doing things when the guidance comes to do them without any guilt attached or any fear attached, well, all that gets cleaned up. It gets cleaned up by the clean prompts. And pretty soon, you're not living as if you're unworthy.